Right, so with a new post-Assad era now commencing in Syria, to the glee of the US and Israel, the backers of these so-called Syrian rebels, who are nothing of the kind in reality, it has to be noted that for as much as Assad was a proper wrong-'un, Israel have wanted Syria to fall for years. It has had to fall, because as far as Western media talk about the Iran-led axis of resistance, Syria was the central, most intrinsic part of that, the heart of the axis. And whether it was Assad or someone else, the reality is that Syria has always had to come under some kind of Israeli influence and control to put an end to that. From the inception of the State of Israel in 1948, they have been at war with Syria. And with Syria in such a key position, taking it down would be a devastating blow to said axis of resistance, now split apart and separated. It has taken years for Israel to get to this point, but now they are there, and as we witness Israeli troops crossing the Golan Heights and entering Syria themselves, invading Syria themselves, and distancing themselves now from the support of these rebels that they offered, their real motivations, I fear, are about to become very clear. Right, so as Israel are reportedly now crossing into Syria following the fall of the Assad regime, we do need to talk about how we got here to see where things are headed. All of this has kicked off conveniently as Israel began a ceasefire with Lebanon, of course, even as Israel have repeatedly and incessantly breached that ceasefire more than 140 times at this point. But who's counting? Not the media, that's for sure. They've cast quite the blind eye to it. And social media and alternative media, as per usual, are the ones who end up doing the real journalism of holding power to account. But following that ceasefire beginning, Israel have had its backside handed to it on a plate. A face-saving exercise was needed, and indeed, in part, the ending of the Assad regime in Syria has helped to do that, because people are talking about something else now, even if Israel are now trying to make it appear that they haven't been supporting these so-called rebels, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham or HTS, these people having formerly been part of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and are still designated as terrorists now, just as they were before, despite the name change, because that really is all that's changed. Syria is of enormous strategic significance. It sits with Lebanon to the west, almost completely surrounding Lebanon as it does. It has Jordan to the south, Iraq to the east, and Turkey to the north. A small, heavily disputed border with Israel as well lies to the southwest. Lebanon, and therefore Hezbollah, have been cut off from Iran because Syria was the conduit between the two. It was of enormous logistical importance, and how that may be overcome now is quite difficult to see. The land transfer route has now been cut off. The transfer of weapons and resources has become far more difficult now. Are there possible air and sea routes? Possibly sea routes via Yemen and the Houthis in the Red Sea? Maybe. Possibly by air, but where from? Because Syrian, Jordanian and Turkish airspace are going to be off limits. It's a massive loss for Hezbollah, for Lebanon, who as a result of this diversion by Israeli interest into Syria, now look a lot more vulnerable, a sovereign state in its own right, ripe for the taking more than it ever has been before by Israel, once this ceasefire sham is over. And Israel have wanted this for decades, of course. Their numerous attempts to invade Lebanon are historical fact, and the illegality of invading a sovereign state doesn't ever seem to bother Israel at all. Cover always gets provided for them, of course. Syria was a sovereign state too, after all, but that hasn't made any difference, has it? But not only was Syria allowing the transfer of aid and munitions from Iran, not only did they have the transfer network essential to movements between different elements of the axis of resistance, they were also the centre for weapons research and development. They had the science in their possession to do the work of keeping up with weapons development, so the capabilities and advancements of other axis groups going forwards may well be hindered significantly as well. Now, for all of that, you might wonder why Syria didn't take a more proactive role against Israel, in which case, as it committed its genocide in Gaza and its invasion of Lebanon, as other Axis groups did, like Hezbollah and the Houthis and Islamic resistance, etc. And the simple matter of that is that the ongoing war in Syria, the civil war in Syria, was predominantly their biggest preoccupation. It was too preoccupied with its own internal struggles, fighting against the likes of HTS, who controlled the Idlib government, have been a problem for years for the Syrian regime, and tipping the scales only now that they got backup from the west, Turkey in the north, and of course Israel. But that isn't to say they weren't doing anything. Hezbollah had made a number of increasingly more southern attacks on Israel itself, notably the Tel Nof air base near Tel Aviv. And it was modified Syrian munitions that were helping them to do that, increasing the range and reducing the weight of these missiles that they were providing, while still delivering the same impact. It is adaptation and technical innovation as much as logistics that have now been lost to those taking on Israel with the fall of Syria. But coming back to HTS now, though, it is the involvement of the likes of the US and Israel with them that has shown this invasion of Syria was only a matter of time, no matter who was in charge there. And it was in light of the Lebanese ceasefire that opened the window for the final push following years of planning. HTS were just one of many splintered and disunited factions kicking about in Syria, warlords within Syria. And it was via US and Turkish intelligence that these groups had been brought together. Here's an excerpt from the Cradle explaining that. In reality, the HTS operation was by no means a spur-of-the-moment offensive, but rather a result of years-long preparations spearheaded by US and Turkish intelligence to unify the ranks of various extremist factions in Syria's north. This project took place under the direct supervision of the Turkish army, which aimed to converge the militant groups in Idlib and the Aleppo countryside and place decision-making in the hands of mainly two parties, the so-called Syrian National Army, SNA, which is loyal to Ankara, and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, which is the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria. In this mashup of terror outfits of the Turkestan and Uyghur jihadist groups, used primarily as strike forces in specific military operations, largely fulfilling the interests of their US and Turkish funders. Military expert Brigadier General Haytham Hassoun confirms that preparations to launch this operation began a long time ago, and that the participating groups established a joint ops room about a month and a half ago. He believes that the militants benefited from misdirection and electronic warfare media operations carried out by Turkish intelligence to camouflage their intentions and movements, and by Turkish occupation forces inside Syria during the days preceding the shock offensive. The militants further benefited from sophisticated intel that helped them exploit existing loopholes on the ground and were aware of vacuums in the Syrian army's positions, which then led to this breach and confusion in the defence lines. So where does Israel come into that picture, or are they just letting the US and Turkey do all of this work to aid terrorists who are basically Al-Qaeda in order to destabilise a government, regardless of what your thoughts are on Assad and his leadership, that is by and large anti-Israel? Well, they've also been aiding these terrorists for years. They've been providing medical aid and logistical support. They've been treating Al-Qaeda terrorists in Syria better than the people of Gaza. But that I don't think would surprise anybody these days. They have this relationship with them. It has been built up over years. And finally, where Israel looked like complete failures following yet another routing in Lebanon, their HTS allies and other groups launched this coup in Syria and have taken over, aided and abetted in no small part by Turkey and the US. Yet now Israel's backpedaling has started on their relationship with HTS. It has now become public knowledge. Word has got out, though obviously not in the mainstream news, where these so-called rebels are getting lionized as liberators, that they are in fact terrorists. You can't rehabilitate Al-Qaeda, yet that is exactly what is being attempted. Rename them, give them a fresh start, make them seem moderate and open-minded, when the complete opposite is of course true. It is only a matter of time before the reality gets revealed. It happened in Afghanistan when the Taliban took over again, and repression started all over. It will happen in Syria too, which is why Israel aren't wasting any time, it seems, invading Syria for themselves. But then they've got a slightly different goal in mind, of course, haven't they? Where Turkey and the US sought to destabilise Syria, move in for the oil maybe, disrupt the axis of resistance, give Iran a bloody nose, Syria is just part of Israel's greater Israel plans. It's that sort of mentality, it's these sort of hard-right figures that are running Israel these days, the people who want this greater Israel plan. It must now fall under their control, therefore, and as such, not only are they distancing themselves from HTS, but they are themselves making it clear that these people are Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and therefore should be hated because of that. What Israel is also attempting here is an attempt to get themselves off first place of the Who's the Biggest Global Pariah 2024 competition and deflect that onto an organisation they are now helping to expose as one of the most feared and unhinged terrorist groups in living memory. That they are throwing allies like the US Biden administration and Turkey's Erdogan administration under the bus over this, well, it's hardly the first time Netanyahu has done that. Biden's on his way out anyway. What's he got to lose? And Erdogan, well, people don't think much of him globally anyway. Netanyahu has done this every time a ceasefire in Gaza has been discussed, has he not? For example, here's a comment from Israeli Diaspora Minister Amichai Chikli on the events in Syria from Al Jazeera and Israel's sudden attitude towards HTS. Amichai Chikli, Israeli Diaspora Affairs Minister, says the opposition advances in Syria are far from a cause for celebration for his country, as he calls for the renewal of Israel's control at Mount Hermon in the occupied Golan Heights and the establishment of a new line of defence based on the 1974 ceasefire line with Syria. Most of Syria is now under the control of affiliate organisations of Al-Qaeda and ISIL, he was quoted as saying by the Israel Hayom newspaper. The majority of Syria's Golan Heights region was occupied by Israel in 1967 and subsequently annexed in 1981. Interesting case of what his demands are there, since Israeli troops have now reportedly moved past that 1974 buffer zone into the Syrian town of KernowDamo, from which there is a straight road, Syria's Route 7, straight to Damascus, which is only an hour up the road. They say they are only there to defend their territory at this point, yet they are taking more Syrian territory in a sequence of ever-increasing phases, getting closer and closer to Damascus, and as close as this image from The Intercept implies, you'd imagine no government of Syria, no matter who that might be, would want Israel that close to them. But as far as HTS goes, and with Israel's rhetoric towards them now, will they still see them as friend or now as foe? With Israel's plans for a greater Israel, could Syria be about to fall to them next? Has that not always been Israel's plan, after all? Where Israel appears to be getting its way militarily, the same cannot be said for its economy, though, which, if there's any chance for all of us to play our part and do our bit to hurt Israel, turning to boycott, divestment and sanctions is absolutely the way to do it. It isn't just as individuals who can make such choices, though. Even big business and sovereign wealth funds even, they can do it too. And one such fund really has just dropped an economic hammer blow on the Zionist apartheid state. Get all the details of that story in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please support the channel if you've got this far through this one and liked what you see with a like, share and subscribe. More content out daily, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers folks.